George Strait sees a boy crying at a gas station, and when he finds out what happened, he changes everything and moves everyone to tears. The morning sun hadn't fully risen over the modest trailer park on the outskirts of San Antonio, but 10-year-old Tommy Miller was already wide awake. His small, nimble fingers worked methodically through the morning routine he had perfected over the past 3 years, setting out his father's medication in neat rows on the kitchen counter, preparing a simple breakfast of toast and scrambled eggs, and making sure his mother's wheelchair was positioned perfectly beside her bed for when she woke. The trailer was small, just 800 square feet of living space, but Tommy kept it immaculate. The floors were swept, dishes washed, and every surface dusted with the precision of someone 3 times his age. This wasn't the life most fifth graders lived, but Tommy Miller wasn't like most children. "Morning, sweetheart," came a soft voice from the bedroom doorway. Rebecca Miller wheeled herself into the kitchen, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her smile as radiant as ever, despite the dark circles under her eyes. At 34, she still possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads, even if those same heads often looked away awkwardly when they noticed the wheelchair. "Mom, I told you to call me when you were ready to get up," Tommy scolded gently, rushing to her side. "Did you struggle again?" Rebecca reached out to smooth a rebellious cowlick in her son's brown hair. "I'm not completely helpless, Tommy. Besides, I heard your daddy stirring. He'll be needing both of us this morning." As if on cue, a thump, followed by a muffled curse, came from the master bedroom. Tommy exchanged a knowing look with his mother before hurrying down the narrow hallway. Michael Miller sat on the edge of the bed, frustration etched across his face as he struggled with the buttons of his flannel shirt. Once the picture of masculine strength at 6'2", the former construction foreman now fought daily battles with the simplest tasks. The accident had left him with a traumatic brain injury that affected his fine motor skills and speech, transforming this once confident man into someone who sometimes couldn't remember how to tie his shoes. "Hey, Dad," Tommy said cheerfully, moving to help with the buttons. "Cowboys or Spurs today?" He gestured to the 2 baseball caps hanging on the wall, Michael's prized possessions from before the accident. "Cowboys," Michael managed, the word stretching and contorting as it passed his lips. He pointed a slightly trembling finger toward the blue and silver cap. Tommy nodded and reached for it, placing it carefully on his father's head. "Good choice. I hear they might actually win this season." Michael's laugh came out as more of a bark, but the humor reached his eyes, the same deep brown eyes he had passed down to his son. Those eyes still held the same intelligence and wit as before. They were windows to the man trapped inside a broken body. "Breakfast is ready, you two," Rebecca called from the kitchen. "Tommy, don't forget you have school in 40 minutes. The morning routine continued with practiced precision. Tommy helped his father to the table, made sure his mother had everything within reach, then quickly wolfed down his own breakfast before rushing to change into school clothes. As he pulled on a slightly faded blue t-shirt, his eyes caught sight of the mason jar on his dresser, the one filled with quarters, dimes, nickels, and the occasional crumpled dollar bill. 127.43. That was the current total, meticulously counted. Each Sunday evening, Tommy had been saving for 3 years now, ever since he overheard his mother crying softly to Aunt Jenny about how she and Michael never got the wedding they'd planned. The accident had happened just 2 months before their scheduled ceremony, and the insurance money and settlement had gone entirely to medical bills and basic survival. Tommy ran his fingers over the cool glass of the jar. At his current rate of saving his lunch money and the occasional dollar earned from helping neighbors with yard work, he figured he'd have enough for a proper wedding in approximately 12 more years. He'd be 22 by then. The thought made his chest tighten. "Tommy, bus in 5 minutes," Rebecca called from the living room. Tommy grabbed his backpack, gave the jar one last longing look, and raced to the door. He kissed his mother on the cheek, gave his father a gentle fist bump. Handshakes were too difficult for Michael now, and dashed out the door. "Love you both. Dad, don't forget your speech therapy exercises. Mom, the lady from social services is coming at 2, and I left your folder on the coffee table," he called over his shoulder. Rebecca and Michael exchanged a look that contained equal parts pride and heartbreak. "That boy," Rebecca whispered. "Too old," Michael agreed, the sadness evident even through his stilted speech. Outside, Tommy raced to the bus stop at the entrance of the Whispering Pines trailer park, his mind already planning the afternoon. Mrs. Hernandez next door needed her flower beds weeded. That would be $5. And if he skipped buying chocolate milk at lunch every day this week, he could add another $3.25 to the jar. The yellow school bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes, and Tommy climbed aboard, navigating the gauntlet of rowdy kids to find an empty seat near the back. Most of the children at Crawford Elementary kept their distance from Tommy, not because they disliked him, but because there was something unsettling about a 10-year-old who acted like a miniature adult. Kids his age were supposed to be collecting action figures and trading cards, not calculating medication schedules and household budgets. "Hey, Tommy," said a small voice beside him. Ellie Jameson slid into the seat, her blonde pigtails bouncing. She was one of the few kids who didn't seem put off by Tommy's maturity. "Mom wanted me to give you this." She handed him a plastic container filled with homemade cookies. The Jamesons lived 3 trailers down and were among the few neighbors who truly understood the Millers' situation. "Tell your mom thanks," Tommy said, accepting the container with genuine gratitude. The cookies would make a perfect dessert for his parents' lunch. "She also wanted me to remind you that you're welcome to come over any time," Ellie added, "especially if you ever need a break." Tommy nodded but didn't respond. The concept of taking a break seemed foreign to him. Who would help his dad with physical therapy exercises? Who would make sure his mom didn't try to reach the high shelves and risk falling from her chair? Who would manage the calendar of doctor appointments and medication refills? The bus rumbled through the streets of San Antonio, passing from the modest outskirts into the more affluent neighborhoods near the school. Tommy pressed his face against the window, watching as single-wide trailers gave way to sprawling ranch homes with manicured lawns. He didn't feel envy exactly, just a curious detachment, as if he were observing an alien world. Crawford Elementary loomed ahead, a modern building of red brick and large windows. Tommy clutched his backpack tighter as the bus came to a stop. School was both an escape and a burden. For 6 precious hours, he could almost pretend to be a normal kid, losing himself in books and numbers and science experiments. But it was also 6 hours away from home, 6 hours during which anything could happen to his parents. The day passed in a blur of classes. Tommy excelled academically, partly due to natural intelligence, but also because studying was one of the few normal childhood activities that also prepared him for his future responsibilities. Every good grade was a step closer to college, to medical school, to becoming the kind of doctor who could help people like his parents. "Today, class, we have a special project," Mrs. Finch announced during the final period. "It's Family Heritage Week, and each of you will be creating a presentation about your family's traditions and heroes." A wave of excited chatter swept through the classroom, but Tommy felt his stomach knot. Family traditions had largely disappeared after the accident, replaced by medical routines and survival strategies. "You'll need to interview a family member about someone in your family history who showed exceptional courage or achieved something remarkable," Mrs. Finch continued, distributing colorful handouts. "Think of them as your family heroes." Tommy stared at the paper, his mind racing. His father could barely speak a complete sentence without exhausting himself. His mother tried to stay positive, but long conversations often left her in tears as she confronted the reality of their situation. And calling relatives wasn't an option. Most of the extended family had drifted away after the first year of caregiving, uncomfortable with the permanent nature of the miller's struggle. The final bell rang, and Tommy shuffled out with the rest of the students, the project handout crumpled in his fist. As he climbed onto the bus for the ride home, he unfolded the paper and read the requirements again. Interview, poster, 3-minute, presentation, due next Monday. By the time the bus reached Whispering Pines, Tommy had formed a plan. He didn't need to interview anyone. He already knew who his family heroes were. The two people who faced impossible challenges every single day, but still managed to make him feel loved and secure. Tommy unlocked the trailer door to find his mother helping his father with stretching exercises in the living room. Rebecca was counting repetitions while Michael grimaced through the discomfort, his face shining with sweat. 8, 9, 10. Great job, love, Rebecca said, her voice deliberately upbeat. She turned at the sound of the door. Tommy, perfect timing. Can you help your dad with his water while I finish dinner? Tommy dropped his backpack and moved immediately to assist. He held the special cup with its ergonomic handle while his father took careful sips, then helped him wipe away the drops that escaped down his chin. How was school? Michael asked, each word a victory of will over damaged neural pathways. It was fine, Dad. We're doing a project on family heroes, Tommy replied, carefully avoiding mention of the interview requirement. Michael's eyes brightened. You should talk about your grandfather in the Marines. Rebecca wheeled herself back from the kitchenette, a pot of spaghetti balanced carefully on her lap, a dangerous but necessary method of food transportation in their cramped quarters. Or your great-aunt Mildred, who marched with Dr. King, she suggested, maneuvering around the coffee table with practiced precision. Tommy helped set the small dining table, his mind elsewhere. I think I'm going to write about you guys, he said finally, not meeting their eyes. A heavy silence fell over the trailer. Rebecca set down the pot with a thud. Tommy, she began. You're both heroes, Tommy insisted, his voice rising slightly. Every day you fight harder than anyone I know. Dad does speech therapy even though it's frustrating. Mom figures out how to cook from a wheelchair. You both never complain, even when things are really bad. Michael reached out a trembling hand and placed it on Tommy's shoulder. Not heroes, he said firmly. Just parents. Later that night, after his parents were settled in bed, Tommy sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, working on his project by flashlight to save electricity. He carefully glued family photos to a poster board, images from before the accident. When his mother stood tall beside his father, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. Beside these, he placed newer photos. His mother in her wheelchair teaching him to bake cookies, his father struggling but succeeding in throwing a baseball in their tiny yard. In the center, he placed their most treasured possession, the engagement photo that had been meant for wedding invitations that were never sent. His parents stood beneath a blooming magnolia tree, his mother in a simple white dress, his father in a crisp black suit. They looked so young, so full of hopes and plans. As Tommy worked, he could hear the faint sound of music coming from his parents' bedroom, George Strait singing I Cross My Heart. It was their song, the one they had chosen for their first dance at the wedding reception that never happened. Sometimes, when they thought Tommy was asleep, his father would attempt to stand from his wheelchair, and his mother would rise shakily from hers, and they would sway together for just a few precious moments, holding each other up, dancing to the song that still held all their broken dreams. Tommy placed the final photo on his poster and wrote the title in careful block letters, My Heroes, the two strongest people in the world. As he crawled into bed, the mason jar caught his eye in the moonlight streaming through the window. 127,43 was a pathetically small sum against the mountain of what a proper wedding would cost. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a crazy idea was beginning to take shape, one that involved his parents' favorite country singer and a desperate gamble that could change everything. Tommy fell asleep with George Strait's lyrics echoing in his head and plans forming in his dreams, plans that would set in motion events beyond anything his young mind could imagine. The day of the family hero presentations arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made San Antonio residents grateful for air conditioning. Unfortunately, the ancient window unit in the miller's trailer had sputtered its last cool breath 3 days earlier, leaving them to survive on box fans and cold showers. For Tommy, it meant a restless night of tossing and turning. His presentation board safely stored under his bed despite his exhaustion. "You look tired, sweetheart," Rebecca commented as she prepared a simple breakfast of cereal. "Did you stay up working on that project again?" Tommy shrugged, not wanting to admit he'd been awake calculating bills instead. The repair company wanted $200 just to look at the air conditioner, money they simply didn't have. 3 doctor appointments this month had already stretched their budget beyond breaking point, and Tommy had overheard his mother on the phone with the trailer park manager, asking for another extension on the lot rent. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just excited about my presentation." Michael shuffled into the kitchen, his morning movements particularly stiff. The heat made his muscles cramp, adding a new layer of difficulty to his already challenging mobility. "You'll do great," he said, ruffling Tommy's hair as he lowered himself carefully into a chair. Tommy helped serve his father's cereal, making sure the specialized spoon with its thick grip was positioned correctly in Michael's right hand. As he watched his father struggle to bring the spoon to his mouth without spilling, Tommy felt a surge of protective love so intense it almost brought tears to his eyes. These were the moments that outsiders didn't see. The quiet dignity in his father's determination to feed himself, despite how long it took. The way his mother pretended not to notice the splashes of milk on the table. "I better go catch the bus," Tommy said, grabbing his presentation board. "The social worker is coming at 4, right?" Rebecca nodded. "Don't worry about that. Just focus on your presentation." Tommy hesitated at the door. "Mom, do we have any money for the air conditioner?" The shadow that passed over Rebecca's face told him everything before she even spoke. "We'll figure something out, honey. Maybe next week after the disability check comes." Tommy nodded and left, the weight of adult concerns settling over him like an invisible cloak as he trudged to the bus stop. The other kids were already there, excitedly comparing their colorful presentation boards featuring astronaut uncles, CEO aunts, and grandparents who had immigrated with inspiring rags-to-riches stories. "What's your project about?" Tommy asked, Ellie peering curiously at his board, which he kept carefully covered. "My parents," he replied simply. "Oh," she said, her voice falling slightly. Even Ellie, kind as she was, didn't fully understand. Her father was a mechanic with his own shop, her mother a kindergarten teacher. They had challenges, sure, but nothing like what the Millers faced every day. The bus ride to school felt interminable, each bump in the road jostling Tommy's nerves further. By the time they arrived at Crawford Elementary, his stomach was twisted into knots. As his classmates filed excitedly into Mrs. Finch's classroom, Tommy lingered in the hallway, suddenly uncertain. "Coming in, Tommy?" Mrs. Finch asked, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Tommy nodded and followed her inside, setting his board on the designated table at the front of the room. Unlike the other boards covered in glitter, stickers, and colorful borders, Tommy's was simple, just photos and carefully printed labels on plain poster board. He hadn't had access to fancy supplies, and the few dollars he could have used to buy them had gone straight into the mason jar instead. "Who would like to go first?" Mrs. Finch asked, and a forest of hands shot up around Tommy. For the next hour, Tommy watched as his classmates presented tales of grandparents who survived wars, aunts who climbed corporate ladders, and uncles who coached minor league baseball teams. Each story seemed more impressive than the last, accompanied by professional-looking photographs and even small artifacts, medals, newspaper clippings, trophies. "Tommy Miller, you're next!" Mrs. Finch finally called. With trembling hands, Tommy carried his board to the front of the classroom and turned to face his peers. 24 pairs of eyes stared back at him with varying degrees of interest. "My heroes are my parents, Rebecca and Michael Miller," Tommy began, his voice steadier than he expected. 3 years ago, they were in a car accident when a drunk driver hit them on Highway 35. The classroom grew uncomfortably quiet. This wasn't the kind of heroic tale they had been hearing all morning. Tommy pointed to the before pictures. "My dad was a construction foreman who could build anything. My mum was a registered nurse who helped sick kids at the children's hospital. They were supposed to get married, but then the accident happened." He moved his finger to the after photos. "Now my dad has a traumatic brain injury that makes it hard for him to talk and move normally. My mum is paralyzed from the waist down and uses a wheelchair." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Finch's smile had frozen on her face. "But they're heroes because," Tommy continued, only to be interrupted by a snicker from the back of the room. "Heroes," came the voice of Bryce Cooper, the class bully whose father was a successful real estate developer. "Sounds more like they're just broken." A horrified gasp came from Mrs. Finch. "Bryce, that is completely inappropriate." But the damage was done. A few other kids were giggling now, the tension breaking in the worst possible way. "My dad says people like that are just draining the system," Bryce continued, emboldened by the attention. "My dad works hard for his money, and then he has to pay taxes for people who can't work." "That's enough," Mrs. Finch snapped, her face flushed with anger. "Bryce, go to the principal's office right now." Tommy stood frozen at the front of the class, his hands gripping the edges of his presentation board so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The room seemed to be spinning around him as Bryce gathered his things and sauntered toward the door, not looking remotely sorry. "Tommy, would you like to continue?" Mrs. Finch asked gently. Tommy looked at the concerned faces of his classmates, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable, a few still fighting smirks. The carefully rehearsed words about his parents' daily acts of courage evaporated from his mind. "No, thank you," he said quietly, returning to his seat with his board clutched against his chest like a shield. Mrs. Finch quickly called the next presenter, but Tommy barely heard the words. Blood rushed in his ears as he stared blankly at his desk, Bryce's cruel words echoing in his mind, broken, draining the system. The worst part wasn't even the insult. It was the sudden, terrible fear that maybe Bryce was just saying out loud what everyone else thought when they saw his family. When the bell finally rang, Tommy was the first one out the door, ignoring Mrs. Finch's concerned call. He rushed down the hallway toward the boys' bathroom, locked himself in a stall, and allowed the tears he'd been fighting all morning to finally fall. Broken. Is that how the world saw his parents? Is that how they saw themselves? The lunch period came and went, but Tommy remained in the bathroom, unable to face his classmates. It wasn't until the warning bell for the next period that he finally emerged, splashed cold water on his face, and made his way to science class. The rest of the day passed in a haze of hurt and anger. When the final bell rang, Tommy ignored the bus line and began walking, his presentation board tucked under his arm. He couldn't bear to face the other kids. Not today. The 3-mile walk home would be hot and tiring, but it felt like the only option. As he trudged along the busy road, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly, Tommy's thoughts turned dark. The air conditioner, the overdue rent, the medical bills that arrived with terrifying regularity. And now, the realization that people, adults, even, might look at his family with contempt instead of compassion. Halfway home, his throat parched and his forehead beaded with sweat, Tommy spotted a convenience store attached to a gas station. The thought of a cold soda was suddenly irresistible. Digging into his pocket, he found the 2 quarters he'd been saving for his lunch milk. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for the smallest fountain drink. The cool air that greeted him as he pushed open the door felt like heaven after the punishing Texas heat. Tommy made his way to the fountain machine, filled a small cup with ice and Dr. Pepper, and approached the counter. "Just this," he said, placing his 50 cents on the counter. The clerk, a heavy-set man with a name tag reading Earl, squinted at him. "Shouldn't you be in school, kid?" "School's out," Tommy replied, pushing the coins forward. Earl shrugged and rang up the purchase. As Tommy took his first glorious sip of the ice-cold soda, the convenience store door chimed again. A tall man in boots, jeans, and a black cowboy hat entered, nodding politely to Earl, before heading toward the refrigerated section. Tommy froze mid-sip, his eyes widening in recognition. The profile was unmistakable, that distinctive nose, the slight cleft in the chin, the way he carried himself with a relaxed confidence. Tommy had seen that face countless times on album. Covers displayed proudly in their trailer, had heard that voice singing his parents' song night after night. George Strait, the king of country himself, was standing not 10 feet away, examining bottles of water as casually as if he were any other customer. Tommy's heart began to race. This had to be fate. What were the chances that on this particular day, the worst day he'd had in months, he would encounter the very man whose music had been the soundtrack to his parents' love story? For a brief moment, Tommy considered simply watching in awe as the country legend paid for his purchases and left. After all, celebrities probably got tired of being approached by fans. But then Bryce's words echoed in his mind again, broken, and alongside them, the memory of his parents swaying to "I Cross My Heart" in their small living room, holding each other up despite everything. Before he could talk himself out of it, Tommy took a deep breath and approached the country star. "Excuse me, Mr. Strait," he said, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. The tall man turned, surprise registering briefly on his face before a polite smile appeared. "Yes?" Now that he had the singer's attention, Tommy felt his courage faltering. What was he doing? What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound ridiculous? My parents are big fans," he managed, clutching his soda cup like a lifeline. George Strait's smile widened slightly. "Well, thank you. Always nice to meet folks who enjoy the music." He tipped his hat slightly and turned back to the refrigerator case. Tommy knew this was his only chance. In a rush of words that surprised even himself, he blurted out, "They were supposed to get married dancing to 'I Cross My Heart,' but then they got hit by a drunk driver, and now Mum's in a wheelchair and Dad can hardly talk, and they never got to have their wedding, and I've been saving money, but I only have $127.43, and I don't know if they're going to fix the air conditioner or pay the rent. And today at school a kid called them broken, and I just—" Tommy's voice cracked, and to his horror, he felt tears welling up again. He blinked rapidly, determined not to cry in front of George Strait of all people. The country star was staring at him now, the bottles of water forgotten in his hands. Something in the man's expression had shifted from polite interest to genuine concern. "Slow down there, son," George said, his voice gentler than before. "Let's start over. What's your name?" "Tommy Miller," he replied, swiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Well, Tommy Miller, it sounds like you and your family have been through a rough time," George said, setting the water bottles back in the refrigerator case. "Why don't you tell me about your parents?" And so, standing between the beef jerky display and the lottery ticket counter of a nondescript gas station convenience store, Tommy Miller told George Strait the story of Rebecca and Michael, their love, their tragedy, and their daily battle to create a semblance of normalcy for their son, despite overwhelming odds. As Tommy spoke, fumbling with the folded and refolded photograph he always carried in his pocket, he didn't notice the way George Strait's eyes grew increasingly moist, or how the famous singer's hand occasionally moved to his chest, as if to quiet some physical pain there. "They still try to dance to your song sometimes," Tommy concluded, finally revealing the worn photograph of his parents in their engagement pose. "Even though it's really hard, and they can only do it for a minute or two, they think I don't know, but I hear them at night sometimes." George Strait took the photograph with careful hands, studying the smiling faces of the young couple beneath the magnolia tree. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Tommy feared he had somehow offended the country star with his rambling story. Then, clearing his throat, George handed the photograph back and asked a question that would change the course of Tommy's life forever. "Where do your folks live, son?" The clerk, who had been unabashedly eavesdropping on the entire conversation, leaned across the counter. "You're not really him, are you? George Strait?" The country singer turned and gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Last time I checked." Earl's eyes widened to comical proportions. "Well, I'll be damned. My wife's going to kill me for being at work today." As the clerk began fumbling for his phone, presumably to take a photo, George Strait placed a hand gently on Tommy's shoulder. "What do you say we continue this conversation outside, Tommy?" Tommy nodded, suddenly aware that whatever was happening was extraordinary. As they stepped out into the punishing afternoon heat, George pointed to a black pickup truck parked by the air pump. "That's me over there. I've got a show in Austin tonight, but I think I might have time to make a little detour first. How far away is this trailer park of yours?" Tommy's heart began to race. "About 1.5 miles that way," he said, pointing east. "But you don't have to." George Strait's smile held a strange mixture of sadness and determination. "I think maybe I do, son. I think maybe I do." The black pickup truck moved slowly through the Whispering Pines trailer park, drawing curious glances from neighbors sitting on their small porches, seeking relief from the heat. Tommy sat rigid in the passenger seat, his presentation board wedged awkwardly between his knees and the dashboard, still unable to fully process that George Strait, the George Strait, was driving him home. "It's the blue one at the end," Tommy directed, pointing to a small, single-wide trailer distinguished from its neighbors by a neat flower bed of marigolds and petunias that Rebecca tended from her wheelchair. "The one with the ramp." George nodded, taking in the modest surroundings. The trailer park wasn't the worst place to live. Most units were clean and well-maintained despite their age, but it was clearly a community where every penny counted. Toys, carefully mended rather than replaced, sat in yards. Cars with high mileage and fading paint were parked alongside homes. Window air conditioning units hummed desperately against the Texas heat, except for the silent one in the miller's window. "That's our place," Tommy said with a hint of anxiety in his voice. "But maybe this isn't a good idea. My mom might get overwhelmed, and my dad gets embarrassed when new people have trouble understanding him." George turned off the engine and regarded the boy thoughtfully. "Tommy, I grew up poor in a little place called Pearsall, not too far from here. My daddy was a junior high school teacher, and we lived on a ranch where I did chores before and after school. I'm not somebody who judges folks by their address." Tommy nodded slowly, gathering his courage. "Okay, but please don't mention what I told you about them wanting to get married to your song. It's kind of private." "You have my word," George said solemnly. As they approached the trailer, the door swung open before they could knock. Rebecca Miller appeared in her wheelchair, her expression cycling rapidly from curiosity to shock to disbelief. "Tommy, who is—" she began, then stopped abruptly as recognition dawned. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, my God." "Afternoon, ma'am," George said, removing his black cowboy hat respectfully. "George Strait. Hope you don't mind me dropping your boy off." Rebecca's face had gone pale. You're Tommy, What is going on? Tommy shifted uncomfortably. I met Mr. Strait at the gas station, Mom. He was nice enough to give me a ride. Home. You were at a gas station? I thought you were on the bus. Rebecca's maternal concern momentarily overrode her starstruck confusion. It's a long story, Mrs. Miller, George interjected smoothly. Your son is quite the storyteller. Would it be all right if I came in for a minute? I'd be honored to meet your husband as well. Rebecca's hands flew self-consciously to her hair, then to the worn fabric of her simple cotton dress. Of course. Please come in. Our home is very modest, Mr. Strait. George, please, he corrected gently as he followed them up the wooden ramp that Michael had built during his first year of recovery, when hope for substantial improvement had still seemed possible. Inside, Michael was attempting to fold laundry at the small dining table, his movements slow and deliberate. At the sound of the door opening, he looked up, his practiced smile for Tommy freezing when he registered the tall figure behind his son and wife. Michael, Rebecca said, her voice trembling slightly, we have a visitor. This is George Strait. Michael's eyes widened, and he attempted to stand too quickly, knocking over a carefully stacked pile of towels. Get George Strait, he managed, frustration flashing across his face at the pronounced stutter that emerged when he was nervous or excited. No need to get up, sir, George said, crossing the small living room in 3 strides and extending his hand. It's a pleasure to meet you. Michael stared at the offered hand for a moment before slowly raising his own. Tommy watched with a familiar ache as his father's hand trembled visibly, but George didn't hesitate or flinch. Instead, he clasped Michael's hand firmly, meeting his gaze with genuine respect. Your boy Tommy has been telling me what a strong family you have, George said, settling into a chair that Rebecca hurriedly cleared of magazines. Sounds like you folks have overcome some mighty big challenges. We manage, Michael said, his jaw working hard to form each word. For the next half hour, an extraordinary scene unfolded in the small trailer. George Strait, with 20-plus #1 country hits and millions of albums sold, sat at the Miller's scratched kitchen table, drinking instant iced tea from a promotional fast food cup, listening intently as Rebecca explained their journey since the accident. The first year was just about survival, she said, her initial nervousness giving way to her natural warmth. Michael was in a coma for 3 weeks. When he woke up, we had to learn everything all over again, talking, moving, even swallowing, safely. Michael nodded, occasionally adding short phrases that George paid careful attention to, never rushing him or finishing his sentences as so many people did. And you, ma'am, George asked, Tommy mentioned you were a nurse before? Rebecca's hands unconsciously moved to the wheels of her chair. Pediatric oncology at Methodist Children's. I miss it every day, but the spinal injury... Well, some things aren't meant to be, I suppose. Throughout the conversation, Tommy sat quietly on the worn sofa, watching this surreal intersection of his daily reality with the man whose voice had filled their home for years. He couldn't help noticing how George seemed genuinely interested, not just being polite. There was something in the country star's eyes, a sadness or understanding that went beyond simple compassion. Do you want to see Tommy's project? Michael asked suddenly, pointing to the presentation board Tommy had almost forgotten about. Tommy felt his face flush. Dad, I don't think Mr. Strait wants to... I'd be honored, George interrupted, turning expectantly to Tommy. With reluctance, Tommy retrieved the board and placed it on the table. As George studied the photographs and read Tommy's carefully printed labels, a heavy silence fell over the room. My heroes. The 2 strongest people in the world, George read aloud. Well, based on what I've seen today, I'd say that's about right. Rebecca wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Tommy, honey, is this what upset you at school today? Tommy looked down at his sneakers. "It's nothing, Mom." "Mrs. Finch called while you were gone," Rebecca said gently. "She told me." "What happened with that Cooper boy?" George looked between them curiously. "What happened at school, Tommy?" In halting sentences, Tommy explained the disaster of his presentation and Bryce's cruel comments. As he spoke, he could see his father's hands clenching into fists and his mother blinking rapidly to hold back tears. "People fear what they don't understand," George said when Tommy finished. "And kids often just repeat what they hear at home without thinking." He paused, seeming to wrestle with some inner decision. Then, with a deep breath, he continued. "I don't talk about this much in interviews, but I lost my daughter Jennifer in a car accident in 1986. She was just 13 years old. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and profound. Rebecca's hand moved instinctively to cover George's on the table. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. George nodded, a flash of old pain crossing his features. "For a long time after, I couldn't understand why it happened, why her, why our family. I was angry at the world, at God, at myself for not somehow preventing it." Michael leaned forward, his eyes filled with recognition of a fellow traveler on the road of unexpected tragedy. "The point is," George continued, "I know something about having life turn upside down in an instant. And I know something about finding the strength to keep going when it feels impossible." He turned his attention back to Tommy's project board. "This young man sees what many adults miss. That true heroism isn't about grand gestures or special powers. It's about getting up every morning and facing whatever challenges life has given you with dignity and courage." Tommy felt a warmth spreading through his chest at having his deepest feelings articulated by someone his parents admired so much. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Rebecca wheeled herself over to answer it, revealing a middle-aged woman in business casual attire, clutching a clipboard. "Mrs. Miller, I'm sorry I'm late. Traffic on I-35 was—" The social worker stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as they fell on George. "Is that—" "Ms. Parker, this is Mr. Strait," Rebecca said, a hint of pride in her voice. "He's a friend of the family." George stood and extended his hand. "Just George, please." The social worker appeared momentarily flustered, but quickly regained her professional composure. "I'm here for our scheduled home assessment, but I can come back another time if this isn't convenient." "Not at all," Rebecca assured her. "Tommy, why don't you show Mr. Strait the backyard while we take care of this?" Understanding the need for privacy during these visits, Tommy nodded and led George out through the small back door to a tiny patch of grass enclosed by a chain-link fence. A single lawn chair sat beside a small charcoal grill that Michael could still operate on his good days. "They check on us sometimes," Tommy explained as they stepped outside, "to make sure everything is okay and that I'm being taken care of properly." George nodded thoughtfully, gazing around the small yard. "Your folks are doing a remarkable job, Tommy. You're a fine young man, polite, articulate, responsible beyond your years." More so, Tommy sat down on the concrete step, suddenly exhausted by the day's emotional roller coaster. "But is it enough? The rent is late again. The air conditioner is broken. Dad's medication costs more every month. I heard Mom crying last night about maybe having to move to state housing." George settled onto the lawn chair, his tall frame making it look comically small. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied the gathering clouds on the horizon that promised a late afternoon. "Thunderstorm." Tommy waited, expecting platitudes about things working out or keeping faith. Instead, George asked a question. What was their wedding supposed to be like before the accident? Surprised, Tommy thought back to the conversations he'd overheard. The wedding magazine his mother still kept hidden in her bedside drawer. Nothing fancy. They were going to have it at the Methodist church where my grandparents got married. Mom had a simple dress she bought on sale. Dad was going to wear his best suit, the charcoal grey one that doesn't fit him right anymore. They wanted to have the reception in the church hall with barbecue and homemade pies. Tommy paused, remembering one detail that had always stuck with him. And they were going to dance to your song. George nodded slowly. I cross my heart. Yeah, Mum said it was playing the first time Dad told her he loved her. They were driving back from a concert, one of yours, actually, at the San Antonio Rodeo. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Tommy sensed that George was turning something over in his mind, making some kind of decision. I have a show in Austin tonight, George finally said. Would you and your parents like to come? I could send a car, one that's wheelchair accessible. Tommy's eyes widened. Seriously? They would love that, but his face fell as reality intruded. Dad gets overwhelmed in crowds. The noise, the stimulation, it can trigger his symptoms. And Mom would be worried about accessibility the whole time. George nodded in understanding. What if I arranged something more private, a meet and greet before the show in a quiet space? Before Tommy could respond, the back door opened and Rebecca appeared. The assessment is finished, she said, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety that Tommy recognized from previous visits. Everything okay? He asked. Rebecca nodded. Ms. Parker was very impressed with our family friend. She gave George a grateful smile. She's even going to expedite that application for the home modification grant we've been waiting on. George stood, placing his cowboy hat back on his head. Mrs. Miller, I was just inviting your family to my show in Austin tonight. I understand crowds might be difficult, but I'd be happy to arrange something more comfortable. Rebecca's face registered shock for the second time that afternoon. That's incredibly generous, but I'm afraid... Please, Mom, Tommy interjected. Mr. Strait said he could send a special car and everything. Rebecca hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to give her son this extraordinary experience and the practical complications of managing Michael's needs in an unfamiliar environment. Let me discuss it with your father, she finally said. Back inside, Michael was sitting exactly where they'd left him, but Tommy immediately noticed the tension in his shoulders, the slight twitch in his left cheek that appeared when he was upset. Michael, you won't believe what Mr. Strait is offering, Rebecca began. No, Michael said firmly, the word coming out clearer than most of his speech. Not charity. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Tommy felt his heart sink, recognizing his father's stubborn pride, the same pride that had initially made him refuse help with physical therapy, insisting he could recover on his own. It's not charity, Mr. Miller, George said quietly. It's one veteran extending a courtesy to another. Michael looked up sharply. How did you... The army photo, George said, gesturing to a framed picture on the wall showing a younger Michael in uniform. I served in the army myself, stationed at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. Different times, different wars, but same. Commitment. Something shifted in Michael's expression, a softening, a recognition. But still, Michael began. Dad, please, Tommy interjected. It would mean everything to me. Michael looked at his son's pleading face, then at his wife's hopeful expression. Tommy could see the internal struggle, his father's fierce independence battling against his desire to give his family a moment of joy. Oh, okay. He finally conceded. Just meet and greet, no big fuss. Tommy felt a surge of excitement, but it was quickly tempered by practical concerns. But Mum's chair... I'll have my tour manager arrange everything, George assured them, pulling out his phone. Accessible transportation, private entrance, quiet space before the show. He smiled at Michael. No big fuss, I promise. As George stepped outside to make the call, Rebecca wheeled over to Tommy and drew him into a tight hug. "What did you say to him at that gas station?" she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Just the truth, Mom," Tommy replied, watching through the window as George Strait, the king of country, legendary performer, a man with countless demands on his time, made call after call, arranging what would become one of the most memorable nights of the Millers' lives. When George returned, his expression was satisfied. "Everything's set. A van will pick you up at 6 o'clock. "I don't know how to thank you," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. George waved away her gratitude. "The pleasure is mine, truly." He knelt down to Tommy's eye level. "And you, young man, I expect you to tell me what you think of the show. Critics don't come more honest than 10-year-olds. Tommy grinned, momentarily just a normal, excited kid. "I already know all your songs. Mom and Dad play your albums all the time." As George prepared to leave, he paused by the door, his eyes falling on an old acoustic guitar propped in the corner. "You play?" he asked Michael. Before," Michael answered, gesturing to his uncooperative hands with a flash of deep sadness. George nodded in understanding. "Music stays with us, even when other things change. I'll see you folks tonight." O'Grady. As the black pickup disappeared down the dusty road, the Miller family stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. "Did that really just—" Rebecca began. "George S. Strait," Michael confirmed, a rare smile spreading across his face. Tommy watched his parents' expressions of wonder and felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. For a brief moment, they weren't a family defined by disability and struggle. They were just people excited about meeting a music legend and attending a concert. But as Tommy helped his mother prepare for the evening, selecting her nicest blouse and helping her apply makeup with hands that trembled slightly from excitement, a thought kept nagging at him. George Strait's interest seemed too personal, too invested to be merely kindness to a fan. The way he had spoken about his daughter, the look in his eyes when he saw Tommy's presentation board, there was something more happening here, some deeper current of connection that Tommy couldn't quite identify. What Tommy couldn't possibly know was that as George Strait drove back to his hotel to prepare for that night's performance, he was making more calls that had nothing to do with arranging transportation or backstage passes. Calls to old friends in the music industry, to business contacts in San Antonio, to medical specialists in rehabilitation therapy. Calls that would set in motion events beyond anything Tommy had dared to hope for when he approached a country music legend in a gas station convenience store just hours earlier. In the gathering dusk, as thunder rumbled closer and the first fat raindrops began to fall on the metal roof of the trailer, breaking the oppressive heat at last, the Millers prepared for an evening they thought would be the highlight of their year. They had no idea it was only the beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the night of George Strait's Austin concert. 3 weeks that had transformed the Millers' lives in ways Tommy still struggled to comprehend. The backstage meeting had been everything they'd hoped for and more. George performing "I Cross My Heart" privately for his parents in the green room, Michael managing to speak several complete sentences without stuttering in his excitement, Rebecca laughing more than Tommy had heard in years. But what happened after the concert had been even more extraordinary. George hadn't just given them a memorable evening, he had maintained contact, calling every few days to check in, sending specialists to evaluate Michael for a new type of therapy program, arranging for a local company to install and repair the air conditioner at no cost. "Just a business arrangement with some folks who owe me a favor," he'd insisted when Rebecca tried to refuse. Most surprising of all was the reason behind George's call yesterday. "I'd like to come by and discuss something with all of you, something important." Now Tommy sat beside his parents in their small living room, watching as George Strait paced the limited floor space, his tall frame seeming too large for the modest trailer. The country star had arrived without fanfare, driving himself in the same black pickup truck, dressed in simple jeans and a button-down shirt rather than stage clothes. "So here's what I've been thinking," George said finally, settling into the kitchen chair they'd come to think of as his spot. "Tommy told me something that first day that stuck with me, about how you two never got the wedding you planned." Rebecca and Michael exchanged a quick glance, both looking slightly embarrassed. "That was a long time ago," Rebecca said softly. "We've adjusted our expectations about a lot of things." George leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But what if you didn't have to? What if you could have that wedding after all, perhaps even something better than what you originally planned?" A heavy silence fell over the room as his meaning sank in. Michael was the first to respond, his brow furrowed with a mixture of confusion and caution. What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'd like to help you have the wedding you deserve," George said simply. "Everything taken care of. Venue, food, music, flowers, whatever you want. A proper celebration of what you two have built together, what you've overcome." Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. That's incredibly generous, but we couldn't possibly—" "You could," George interrupted gently. "You absolutely could. I've been blessed with success beyond anything a ranch kid from Pearsall could have imagined. Let me do this." Tommy watched, the emotions play across his parents' faces, hope, disbelief, pride, gratitude, all warring with each other. He held his breath, silently willing them to accept. "Why?" Michael asked finally, the single word clear and direct. George took a deep breath. "When I lost my daughter, I made a promise that I would try to bring some good into the world in her name. Not in big, public ways. Those charity events are important, but they're part of the business. I meant in personal ways, human to human." He gestured toward Tommy. "Your son reminded me of that promise, his courage in approaching me, his devotion to you both. It meant something to me." Rebecca reached for Michael's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "We need to discuss this privately," she said softly. "Of course," George replied, standing. "Tommy, want to show me those tomato plants you were telling me about last time?" As Tommy led George to the small container garden Rebecca had started, on their back step, he could hardly contain his excitement. "Are you really going to give them a wedding?" he whispered, once they were outside. George smiled. "If they'll let me. But it's not about me giving them anything, Tommy. It's about them finally getting something they've earned through their love and perseverance. I'm just removing the obstacles." After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, the back door opened and Rebecca called them in. Tommy could tell immediately from his mother's red-rimmed eyes and tremulous smile what their answer would be. "We've decided to accept your incredibly generous offer," she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "But with conditions." George nodded seriously. "Name them." "Nothing extravagant," Michael said, speaking slowly to ensure clarity. "Something meaningful, not showy. And we want to contribute," Rebecca added firmly. "I can still bake. My mother's pie recipes are legendary in our family. And Michael has woodworking projects he's been able to complete with adaptive tools. Small things like centerpieces, perhaps." "Done," George agreed without hesitation. "This is your wedding. I'm just the facilitator." Over the next hour, they discussed possibilities. Rebecca had always dreamed of an outdoor ceremony under Texas skies. Michael wanted live music, but worried about the cost. Both emphasized the need for accessibility, not just for themselves, but for several friends from their support group who also used mobility aids. "Leave the logistics to me," George assured them, "but I'll need your input on the guest list, your preferences for food, music, all those details." As the planning conversation continued, Tommy noticed his father growing increasingly animated, stuttering less as his excitement overcame his speech difficulties. His mother's posture had changed too, sitting straighter in her wheelchair, gesturing with her hands as she described the simple dress she had once picked out, now long returned to the store. "When were you thinking this might happen?" Rebecca asked, trying to sound casual, though Tommy could hear the eagerness beneath. "How does 6 weeks from now sound? Early October, before it gets too cool for an outdoor event?" Rebecca's eyes widened. "So soon? Most venues book a year in advance. For weddings." A shadow crossed George's face. "Let me worry about the venue. 6 weeks gives us enough time to plan properly, but not so long that we overthink it." As George prepared to leave that evening, laden with notes about the miller's preferences and a guest list of approximately 50 close friends and family members, Tommy walked him to his truck. "Mr. Strait," he said hesitantly, "is 6 weeks really enough time to arrange everything?" George smiled reassuringly. "It is, when you have the right connections. Don't worry, Tommy. Your parents are going to have a beautiful day." What Tommy couldn't have known was that George's confidence masked a growing concern. Finding a suitable venue on short notice, one that was beautiful, accessible, and available, was proving more challenging than he had anticipated. His assistant had already called 12 potential locations, only to find them either booked solid or prohibitively expensive due to the rush. There was one more option to explore, the most promising yet, according to his event planner. The Grove at Willow Creek was a new venue just outside San Antonio, featuring picturesque grounds, a renovated historic building, and a reputation for exclusive events. Most importantly, they had a cancellation for the first Saturday in October, exactly when George hoped to hold the Miller wedding. 2 days later, George drove through ornate iron gates, following a winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees, until he reached a stunning Spanish-style hacienda. The grounds were immaculate, flowering gardens, a stone terrace overlooking a small lake, strands of Edison bulbs hanging ready to illuminate evening celebrations. A slender man in his 50s, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit despite the Texas heat, emerged from the main building as George parked. "Mr. Strait, what an honor. I'm Elliot Chambers, owner of the Grove." He extended a manicured hand. "When your assistant called about the availability, I could hardly believe it. The king of country interested in our humble venue." George shook the man's hand firmly. "Appreciate you making time to meet on such short notice, Mr. Chambers. Please call me Elliot, and it's absolutely no trouble. We're thrilled at the possibility of hosting an event for you. A private party, I understand? Perhaps a family celebration?" "Something like that," George replied, deliberately vague. "Mind showing me around first?" For the next 45 minutes, Elliot led George through the property, pointing out various amenities and sharing anecdotes about celebrity clients and luxury weddings they had hosted. The venue was undeniably beautiful, with thoughtful details and elegant spaces that would photograph well. Most importantly, the date George needed was indeed available due to a last-minute cancellation. The couple had a rather messy breakup just after placing their deposit, Elliot confided with barely concealed glee. "Their misfortune could be your good fortune." As they completed the tour on the main terrace, George felt satisfied. The location was perfect, intimate enough for the Miller's modest guest list, but still special. Now came the more delicate part of the conversation. "It's a beautiful place you've got here, Elliot. I think it might be just what we're looking for, but I need to be upfront about the nature of the event." Elliot leaned forward eagerly. "Of course. Whatever you need, we can accommodate." "It's a wedding, but not for me or my family," George clarified. "I'm hosting it as a gift for a very special family I've come to know. The groom has a traumatic brain injury that affects his speech and mobility. The bride uses a wheelchair full-time. Accessibility is absolutely non-negotiable." Elliot's eager smile faltered slightly. "A charity case?" How noble of you." George felt a prickle of unease at the man's tone, but continued, "They're not a charity case. They're remarkable people who deserve a beautiful wedding day. I just need to ensure the venue can accommodate their needs." Elliot cleared his throat, his demeanor cooling noticeably. "Well, we do have an accessibility ramp at the side entrance." "I'd need more than that," George interrupted. "The bride would need to access all the same areas as any other bride: main entrance, bridal suite, ceremony site, reception area, restrooms, no back entrances or service elevators." The venue owner's smile had become fixed. "That could be challenging. Our main entrance has those gorgeous Spanish steps that are a signature feature. And the bridal suite is on the second floor. Part of its appeal is the balcony overlook." "But there are solutions," George pressed. "Temporary ramps, perhaps? I'm happy to cover any additional costs." Elliot shifted uncomfortably. "Temporary structures would compromise the aesthetic integrity of the property, Mr. Strait. We've built our reputation on a certain visual experience. Our clients expect perfection." George felt his temperature rising, but kept his voice level. "I'm talking about a wedding for two people who love each other, not a photo shoot for a magazine." Of course, Elliot said hurriedly. "Perhaps we could discuss some compromises. The side entrance is quite nice, really, and we could set up a special area for the handicapped guests to view the ceremony from a distance." George stared at the man, scarcely believing what he was hearing. From a distance? "Well, you understand, wheelchairs on our pristine lawn would leave tracks, potentially ruining the experience for other guests. And if the groom's speech is affected, as you mentioned, perhaps a recorded vow might be more dignified for everyone's comfort." A heavy silence fell between them. When George finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Let me be sure I understand you correctly. You're suggesting that the bride should enter through a side door, not be able to access her own bridal suite, watch her guests enjoy the grounds she can't fully access, and that her groom should pre-record his vows because his actual voice might make people uncomfortable." Elliot paled slightly, clearly recognizing he had miscalculated. "I wouldn't put it quite that way." "I think you just did," George interrupted. He looked around the beautiful grounds, seeing them now through different eyes. "You know what I find interesting, Elliot? You've got all these fancy amenities, custom lighting, imported furniture, that hand-painted dance floor you were so proud of. But you missed the most basic thing: creating a space where all people are welcomed with dignity. Mr. Strait, please understand our position. We cater to a certain clientele with specific expectations." "And what exactly are those expectations?" George asked, his voice rising slightly. "That they won't have to be reminded that people with disabilities exist? That they can pretend the world is only made up of people who look and move exactly like they do?" A young woman, who had been arranging flowers nearby, had stopped to listen, her eyes wide as she recognized George. "This isn't about aesthetics," George continued, warming to his subject now. "It's about basic human respect. Those handicapped guests you're so worried about, they love just as deeply, dream just as vividly, and deserve to celebrate just as joyfully as anyone who walks through your main entrance." Elliot's face had flushed a deep red. "Now, see here." "No, you see here," George countered, his usual calm demeanor giving way to genuine anger. "I came prepared to pay your premium rates, to cover any reasonable accommodation costs, to bring my name and, yes, a certain amount of positive publicity to your establishment. Instead, I find myself wondering how many other families you've turned away or relegated to second-class treatment because they didn't fit your aesthetic." By now, several staff members had gathered at a discreet distance, obviously listening. Elliot noticed them too, and attempted to salvage the situation. Perhaps I misspoke. We could certainly look into temporary accommodations. Don't bother, George said, putting his hat back on. You know what's interesting about Texas? We've got no shortage of beautiful places. But finding people with beautiful hearts, that's the real challenge. He turned to leave, then paused. You might want to look into the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's not just good manners to make your venue accessible, it's the law. As George walked back to his truck, the young woman who had been arranging flowers hurried after him. Mr. Strait, I just wanted to say, my brother uses a wheelchair. What you just said, thank you. George nodded, his anger softening. What's your name? Maria Vasquez. I'm just the florist's assistant here. Well, Maria, it sounds like you might be looking for a new place to arrange flowers soon. I may have a job for you. He handed her his manager's business card. Give him a call tomorrow. Back in his truck, George sat for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The confrontation had left him shaken, not because he regretted standing up for the Millers, but because it reminded him how much work remained to be done in changing people's hearts and minds. He started the engine and pulled out his phone, dialing a familiar number. James, it's George. Remember that ranch property I looked at last year, the one with the old dance hall I thought about renovating? Is it still available? He listened for a moment, then smiled. Perfect. Let's make an offer immediately, and I'm going to need a construction crew that can work fast. We've got a wedding to host in 6 weeks. As George drove away from the grove at Willow Creek, a plan was already forming in his mind, one that would not only give Rebecca and Michael the wedding of their dreams, but might also create something lasting that could benefit many others in similar situations. What had begun as a simple act of kindness was evolving into something much bigger. The man known for singing about love and heartbreak was about to make a statement that went far beyond lyrics and melodies, a statement about dignity, inclusion, and the true meaning of hospitality. And when the media eventually got wind of Elliot Chambers' treatment of persons with disabilities, which they inevitably would, given how many staff members had witnessed the confrontation, the Grove at Willow Creek would learn a hard lesson about the cost of discrimination in the court of public opinion. But George wasn't thinking about revenge or justice as he drove back toward San Antonio. He was thinking about Tommy's face when he'd first approached him at that gas station, earnest, hopeful, determined, and he was thinking about the promise he'd made, not just to the Millers but to himself, that this wedding would be everything Rebecca and Michael deserved. No back entrances, no compromises on dignity, no settling for less because society deemed them somehow less worthy of beauty and celebration. As he reached the outskirts of San Antonio, George made another call, this one to an old friend who owned a construction company specializing in accessibility modifications. Pete, it's George Strait. Remember that favor you've been saying you owe me since 1985? I'm finally ready to collect. The first Saturday in October dawned with the kind of perfect Texas weather that seemed almost too good to be true. Clear blue skies, temperatures in the mid-70s with just enough breeze to rustle the leaves of the ancient oak trees. For Tommy Miller, who had barely slept the night before from excitement, it felt like the universe itself was celebrating along with his family. "Tommy, are you awake, honey?" Rebecca called from outside his bedroom door. It was the first time in 3 years that she had come to wake him rather than the other way around. "Been up for hours, Mum," he replied, already dressed in the new suit that had arrived by special delivery the previous week, his first real suit, tailored perfectly to his slender frame. The card had simply read, "Every best man needs to look sharp. G.S." When Tommy opened his door, he found his mother already in her wheelchair, but looking different than he had ever seen her. Her hair had been professionally styled the evening before, falling in soft waves around her face. Her makeup was subtle, but brought out the green of her eyes. But it was her smile, radiant, unguarded, almost girlish, that transformed her. "You look beautiful, Mom," Tommy said, his voice catching slightly. "Just wait until you see the dress," she replied with uncharacteristic excitement. "It's everything I ever dreamed of, but better because it's designed for sitting. No awkward bunching, no excessive fabric. I never knew a wedding dress could be both beautiful and practical." Throughout the small trailer, evidence of the upcoming celebration was everywhere. Michael's suit hung on the back of the bedroom door. Rebecca's grandmother's pearls, her something old, lay carefully on a blue handkerchief, her something blue. Flowers had been delivered at dawn, simple arrangements, of Texas wildflowers mixed with more elegant roses and lilies. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Rebecca's sister Jenny, who had flown in from Oregon for the wedding, along with a professional hair and makeup artist George had arranged. "Look at you," Jenny exclaimed, embracing her sister. "The bride-to-be again." For the next few hours, the Miller home became a whirlwind of activity. Michael was picked up by his brother to get ready at a hotel room George had arranged near the venue, adhering to the tradition that the groom shouldn't see the bride before the ceremony. Tommy helped where he could, running small errands and trying to stay out of the way of the growing number of women who filled their small home, all there to help Rebecca prepare. At noon, a luxury, accessible van arrived to transport Rebecca, Tommy, and the bridal party to the mysterious venue. George had kept the location a surprise, telling them only that it was somewhere special, not far from San Antonio. As the van turned off the main highway onto a private road, Tommy pressed his face to the window, curiosity consuming him. They passed through an unassuming gate and followed a winding gravel road for nearly a mile before the trees opened up to reveal their destination. "Oh my God," Rebecca whispered beside him. Before them stood an old Texas dance hall, the kind that had hosted country music legends for generations. But this one had clearly undergone recent renovations. The weathered wooden exterior had been lovingly restored. A wide wooden ramp with gentle slopes provided access to the wraparound porch, and string lights hung from every available surface, waiting for dusk to transform the space into a wonderland of tiny stars. A hand-painted sign hanging above the entrance read, "Miller Wedding, October 1st, 2025. As the van pulled to a stop, George Strait himself appeared on the porch, dressed in a black suit with a bolo tie, looking every inch the country gentleman. "Welcome to Starlight Dance Hall," he said, opening the van door and helping deploy the ramp. Or at least that's what it used to be called back in the 50s. It's been abandoned for decades until recently. Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth. "It's perfect. But how did you find this place? And how did you get it ready so quickly?" George helped her wheelchair navigate the ramp. "Let's just say I know some folks who can work miracles when properly motivated. Some of them are eager to meet you. They've been working round the clock to get everything just right." Inside, the transformation was even more dramatic. The old dance hall had been completely renovated, with a perfect blend of rustic charm and modern accessibility. The original hardwood floors gleamed with fresh polish, but had been carefully leveled to eliminate any unexpected bumps or thresholds. The stage where countless country musicians had performed remained, now decorated with an arch of wildflowers and roses. Wooden pews had been arranged in a semicircle, with spaces deliberately left open for wheelchairs throughout, not segregated to the back or sides, but integrated naturally among the seating. "Every detail has been considered," George explained as he showed them to the bride's room, a spacious, accessible suite created from what had once been the dance hall's office. "We've got accessible restrooms, pathways wide enough for 2 wheelchairs to pass each other, a dance floor specially finished to be smooth for wheels but not slippery for walking, and ramps everywhere instead of steps." Tommy watched his mother's eyes fill with tears. "You did all this for us? In 6 weeks?" George shook his head. "Not just for you, though you were certainly the inspiration. After this weekend, Starlight will continue as an event venue, fully accessible for anyone who wants to celebrate here. It's something that's been missing in this area for too long. As the hour of the ceremony approached, Tommy was escorted to a room where his father was preparing with his groomsmen. When he entered, he almost didn't recognize the man standing before the mirror, straightening his tie with hands that trembled, less than usual. Michael Miller stood taller than Tommy had seen in years, dressed in a charcoal grey suit similar to the one he'd planned to wear to his original wedding, but custom-tailored to accommodate his changed physique. His hair had been freshly cut, his face clean-shaven, but it was the clear determination in his eyes that truly transformed him. "Dad, you look amazing," Tommy said, reverting momentarily to his father's speech pattern in his emotion. Michael turned and smiled, a full, uncomplicated smile. "Feel amazing," he said, the words coming more clearly than usual. Tommy knew his father had been practicing with his speech therapist for weeks, determined to speak his vows as clearly as possible. "Ready to finally marry Mom?" Tommy asked. Michael nodded firmly. "Been ready for 13 years. At precisely 4 o'clock, the ceremony began. Tommy took his place beside his father at the front of the hall, heart pounding with anticipation. The 60 guests, a mix of family, friends, medical professionals who had become like family, and members of their support group, all turned expectantly toward the entrance. The old wooden doors swung open, and Rebecca appeared in her wheelchair, transformed into a vision that took Tommy's breath away. Her dress was a masterpiece of ivory lace and satin, designed specifically for wheelchair use, with a fitted bodice and a skirt that draped elegantly over the wheels without excess fabric to get caught. She wore her grandmother's pearls around her neck and a crown of tiny wildflowers in her hair. But it was her expression, a mixture of joy, love, and triumph, that made her truly radiant. The traditional wedding march began to play, but then shifted unexpectedly into a familiar melody. George Strait himself stepped onto the small stage, microphone in hand, and began to sing "I Cross My Heart" as Rebecca made her way down the aisle, propelling her chair with confident strokes, her eyes fixed on Michael. There wasn't a dry eye in the hall as she reached the front. Michael stepped forward without assistance, standing as straight as his body would allow, and took her hands. In his, the minister, an old friend of the family, began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to celebrate not just the union of Rebecca and Michael, but the enduring power of love to overcome any obstacle. These two have already lived their vows of, in sickness and in health, more profoundly than most ever will. Today, they make official what their hearts have known all along, that they belong to each other for all time." When the time came for the vows, Michael took a deep breath. Tommy held his own breath, knowing how much his father had practiced for this moment, how determined he was to speak clearly just this once. "Rebecca," Michael began, his voice slow but remarkably clear. "When life changed everything else, it never changed my love for you. You are my strength, my purpose, my joy. I promise to love you every day, in every way I can, for as long as I live." The simple words, delivered with such effort and sincerity, held more power than the most eloquent speech could have. Rebecca was openly crying now, holding Michael's hands like lifelines. When her turn came, her voice was steady despite her tears. "Michael, 13 years ago, I fell in love with your strength, your laugh, your tender heart. These past 3 years, I've fallen in love with you all over again, with your courage, your perseverance, your unwavering spirit. Our journey hasn't been what we planned, but I wouldn't want to walk or roll it with anyone else." A ripple of appreciative laughter mixed with sniffles ran through the guests at her gentle joke. "With this ring," they each said in turn, "I thee wed." "By the power vested in me," the minister concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Michael, you may kiss your bride." Michael leaned down as Rebecca reached up, their lips meeting in a kiss that represented not just this moment, but the thousands of moments of struggle, determination, and love that had brought them here. The reception that followed was a perfect blend of elegant and casual, sophisticated and homey, exactly what the Millers had dreamed of. The restored dance hall transformed as evening fell, the string lights creating a magical atmosphere. The food was classic Texas barbecue, served on fine china, with Rebecca's famous pies for dessert, alongside a professional wedding cake. Michael's handcrafted wooden centerpieces graced each table, simple but beautiful creations he had painstakingly made during therapy sessions. But the true highlight came during the traditional first dance. As George once again took the stage to sing "I Cross My Heart," Michael surprised everyone by carefully helping Rebecca stand from her wheelchair. With braces on her legs and his arms supporting her waist, they swayed together in a small circle, managing far more than the few minutes Tommy had seen them achieve before. They had been secretly working with physical therapists for weeks, building stamina for just this moment. There wasn't a dry eye in the house as they completed their dance, a testament to determination, love, and the power of having something joyous to work toward. As the evening progressed, Tommy found himself sitting beside George at a quiet table, watching his parents receive congratulations from their friends and family. "Thank you," Tommy said, the words feeling woefully inadequate for all that had occurred. "This is more than I ever imagined when I talked to you at that gas station." George smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're welcome, Tommy, but this isn't quite finished yet. There's something else I need to talk to you and your parents about." Tommy looked at him curiously, but George just patted his shoulder. "Later. Let's let them enjoy this moment first." As the reception wound down and the last guests began to depart, George gathered the Miller family on the dance hall's porch, now illuminated by the glow of the string lights and the emerging stars above. "I have a few wedding gifts for you," he said. "First, this." He handed Michael an envelope. Inside was a deed to a small house not far from their current neighborhood. Single level, fully accessible, with a yard twice the size of what they had at the trailer park. "George, we can't possibly," Rebecca began, but he held up a hand. "It's not a mansion. It's a modest home that happens to be fully adapted for your needs. The mortgage is reasonable and covered for the first year, giving you time to get on your feet with some other changes that are coming." "What other changes?" Michael asked suspiciously. "I've been talking with some medical specialists who are pioneering new rehabilitation techniques for injuries like yours," George explained. "They believe Michael could regain significantly more function with intensive therapy. Therapy your insurance wouldn't cover, but which I'd like to sponsor." He turned to Rebecca next. "And Rebecca, there's a new position opening at the Children's Hospital's administrative office, patient advocacy for families of children with disabilities. When I mentioned your nursing background and personal experience, they were very interested in talking with you. It's part-time to start, with flexible hours to accommodate your needs." Tommy stared at George in disbelief. This went far beyond a wedding. This was a complete reinvention of their lives, a pathway back to the independence his parents had lost. "Why?" Rebecca whispered, overwhelmed. "Why do all this for us?" George looked up at the stars for a long moment before answering. "When I lost my daughter, it tore a hole in my life that nothing could ever fully repair. Success, fame, wealth, none of it filled that space." His voice grew softer. "But acts of kindness, those help. Not because they make me feel good, though they do, but because they're what she would have done if she'd had the chance to grow up." He looked directly at Tommy then. "And because this young man showed me what true love looks like. Not the kind we sing about in country songs, but the kind that gets up every morning and does whatever needs to be done for the people who matter." Tommy felt tears prick his eyes as George handed him a separate envelope. Inside was a certificate establishing an educational fund in his name, enough to cover college and beyond. "You told me you want to be a doctor someday," George said, "to help people like your parents. I believe you'll do exactly that." As the Millers absorbed the magnitude of these gifts, George added one final touch. "There's a honeymoon, too, whenever you're ready. A fully accessible cabin on my ranch in Texas Hill Country. No rush. It'll be waiting when you want it." Later, that night, as the newlyweds departed in the accessible van that would take them to a hotel for the night, Tommy stood beside George, watching them go. "Will they be okay now?" Tommy asked, the question containing all his years of worry and responsibility. George placed a hand on his shoulder. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, Tommy. They'll still have challenges, but yes, I think they're going to be more than okay." 1 year later, on Michael and Rebecca's first anniversary, the Millers returned to Starlight Dance Hall for a small celebration. The venue had become successful beyond anyone's expectations, hosting events specifically designed for families affected by disabilities, with George's name bringing attention to its mission of accessibility and inclusion. The most meaningful moment of the evening came when Rebecca, after months of determined therapy alongside Michael, stood from her wheelchair and took 3 steps unassisted into her husband's waiting arms. It wasn't a miracle cure. She would always need the chair for distance, but it was progress that medical professionals had once thought impossible. As George once again sang "I Cross My Heart" for their anniversary dance, Tommy watched his parents sway together, both standing for several precious minutes, and thought about how far they had all come from that hot, desperate day at the gas station. The mason jar that had once held his wedding fund now sat on a shelf in their new home, repurposed to collect coins for charity. Beside it stood a framed photograph taken at the wedding, Tommy flanked by his parents and George Strait, all four smiling with the pure joy of dreams realized and burdens lifted. Life wasn't perfect. Michael still had difficult days with his speech and mobility. Rebecca still faced limitations from her paralysis. But the crushing weight of financial insecurity and isolation had been lifted, replaced by community, purpose, and renewed hope. As for Tommy, he had been allowed to reclaim something precious that had been taken from him 3 years earlier: his childhood. With his parents now having appropriate support and resources, he could focus on school, friends, and normal kid activities, secure in the knowledge that his family was going to be okay. And when classmates asked about the country music legend, who sometimes came to watch his baseball games or called to check how he was doing in school, Tommy would simply say, "He's a family friend. He helped us remember that sometimes life's greatest gifts come from unexpected places, even a chance. Meeting at a gas station on the worst day of your life,